said, that makes you not believe me at all.
This just doesn't make sense to me. It doesn't add up. So can we talk about two Chris's? Okay.
Two Chris's.
The tale of two Chris's? Okay. And you need to help me know which Chris I'm looking at today and which Chris you really are. So, Chris number one is right here, right? And fell out of love with his wife. Okay. Started wondering what it might be. He didn't have a wife to take care of and a girl to take care of. Spent some time alone, liked that time alone, came home, may or may not have had a conversation about how to get out of this marriage or how to fix it, but probably how to get out of it. Is looking at a bachelor pad in Brighton and did something terrible to his wife and kids. And that may have been an accident, and I think it was an accident.
That's not the Chris you're looking at right now. No. And the Chris you're looking at is the man who loves these kids and loves his wife and will never, ever, ever do anything to harm them. That's the Chris you're looking at right now. The Chris you're looking at right now wants these kids and his wife back at his house right now. That's the Chris you're looking at.
Why didn't you call 911?
I didn't think anything was wrong.
I think you knew what was wrong.
I did.
Hello and welcome to True Crime Rocket Science. This is episode 11 in the ongoing series, Christopher Watts, What Else Do We Know? The clip that you heard at the beginning was one that made a really big impression on me and is really important to me personally, just because right at the beginning of the Watts case, that was the position I took. I saw from a distance a guy who was an oil worker living in a huge house. I saw someone who was a multi-level marketer living in a huge house. To me, it didn't make any sense. I was aware of the debt. That didn't make any sense. I was looking at photos of this happy family, photo after photo after photo of the smiling family, this perfect family, and meanwhile everyone was dead. I was looking at videos of how happy they were, and meanwhile there was this talk of an affair. And so it very clearly, in my mind at least, showed two Chris Wattses. You sort of saw one Chris Watts kind of on social media, one Chris Watts sort of with his family, and then there was some kind of unknown other Chris Watts. And in a weird way, more than a year later, more than a year and a half later, we still are wondering who this other Chris Watts is. This Chris Watts that has been so carefully hidden from us, we're still sort of wondering who that person is. And so I felt tremendously validated. I mean, obviously when I wrote the Two-Face series, way back the first book came out in September, I had to kind of make up my mind what we were dealing with, who we were dealing with really early on. And so, every single book was named Two-Face. And obviously, I think around about 3 or 4 books were written before the discovery came out. And so this particular moment was tremendously validating for me to have an FBI agent. It wasn't even Tammy Lee. This is the first person who kind of said, well, there's another Chris. And what was equally fascinating was the way Chris Watts doesn't just deny it or sort of make excuses. He sort of takes on the metaphor. He says, the Chris Watts you're looking at is, and then he describes the Chris Watts that everyone thought they knew. And of course, at that time, he'd been hiding the affair. So I just found that whole thing, that whole moment, which is quite a long moment, and it's referred to at some length in the discovery. I found that tremendously validating. Ironically, I came up with the name Silver Fox independently of the discovery. I just thought that would be a good thing to build on the Two-Face series, and subsequently I found that Watts' colleagues had referred to him not only as Rain Man, but they actually called him Silver Fox as kind of a nickname. His colleagues called him that. So I found that also just quite amazing, how one can intuitively know more than you actually realize you know. Speaking of which, the second book in the Silver Fox trilogy has just become available on Amazon. The Silver Fox trilogy are completely different to the Two-Face series in that it is taking the narrative a lot further and a lot deeper, dealing far more personally with Chris Watts. The first book deals with the third confession and just tries to sort of peel away the psychology a lot further. The second book does that in a much more in-depth way, and I'm quite excited about this book. It took on a very different approach, and I was very surprised at how much insight just sort of bubbled to the surface as a result. Normally, I take a strictly true crime approach to books like this, and in this book, I literally looked at the case, obviously anchoring it in discovery and in statements and so on, but I looked at the whole thing through the prism of marriage. I looked at Chris Watts through the prism of marriage. I looked at Shanann through the prism of marriage. I looked at Nicole Kessinger through the prism of marriage. I looked at the whole sort of triangle of these three people through what I call weddedness, the concept of weddedness. How wedded was each person really? What were their motivations? How was the one's weddedness different to the other, and how was the one pulling on the other one's weddedness? And so that was really a fascinating thing, and I did come across a few things that I didn't know before myself, even after 11 books. So I'm really excited to let you guys know about this. In terms of this episode today, what I'm going to be doing is taking you through the chronology. Some people that are new to this series seem to wonder, are you just sort of regurgitating tidbits of information, waffle here, waffle there? It may seem like that. Basically, what the Christopher Watts What Else Do We Know series is about is it's going back chronologically through the timeline to something that I laid down on Crime Rocket. I did it not so much for you guys, not so much for the public, but so that I could go back and look at what we knew or thought we knew and then how that changed. It was also just to record certain things that we knew as we knew it. But the most important aspect was the chronology, looking at what we thought, what we didn't know, what assumptions were made that turned out not to be true, and just how the whole narrative unfolded, but chronologically. And it's very easy to miss certain things. There's certain things that we thought we knew, and then as your knowledge base expands, you forget that you knew that, or you forget that you didn't know that. So one of the things I'm going to be highlighting here is, for example, for a while, I certainly assumed that the children had actually been killed on Friday or even on Saturday, but not on Sunday. I thought that the children were killed really early on, and then so it turned out, I think we found this out in mid-September or sometime in September. Jeremy Lindstrom came forward and he said, Chris Watts was at his home and they were at a birthday party. So that's one of the aspects that we didn't know and then we later did know, and it's just interesting to look at that. So So that's what we're going to be dealing with in this particular episode. There are going to be around about 50 episodes in total going right through the timeline. The August and September sections are really quite long, and then they start thinning out, especially after November. The chronology starts thinning out. The amount of news coming through got less and less. So that's what we're going to be going through. So if you're interested in that sort of thing, if you're interested in a different version of the Chris Watts analysis that's anchored in the discovery, that's anchored in what we absolutely know, then you might find this channel worth your while. Please subscribe. Very important that you like, leave a comment, and share through your social networks. I'm really trying to grow this channel to 10,000. I don't know if that's too much, too ambitious, but so if you're interested in that, please subscribe. And let's get started. Right, so as I mentioned, we are dealing with the September part of the chronology. We are busy with September, and we are not at the beginning of September, but around about the middle. And so what we are looking at is from point 35. I think it goes on to 60 something, although there are sub points. So in this episode, we're going to be looking at around about from 35 to 50 something. So a fair amount of content. One thing I just want to sort of go into before we deal with number 35 is there's a section just above that dealing with the containers and the back of Chris Watts' truck. There's a fascinating sort of admission that Chris Watts makes, where he says that he loaded large clear containers into his truck. So he's admitting that he loaded transparent containers, right? So these shouldn't be confused with the sort of containers you see, that you can see on Chris Watts' truck. He's talking about transparent containers, and that can only be a plastic container. And what was in his basement? What was his basement full of? Plastic containers, transparent containers, right? Also, it refers to the discovery. Chris Watts talks about having containers full of it downstairs in terms of medication. He even texts this. So I think a lot of people think that I've made this up because it's convenient or something, but there are many references to those containers besides actually seeing them in the basement. Chris Watts texts, there's a text message where he refers to containers full of medicine downstairs. That's part of the text that's in the discovery. He talks about loading containers on page 593 of the discovery, loading large clear containers. That's referred to in the discovery, and then again on 1162, where he talks about what he would load into his truck, and he speaks about my book bag, my lunchbox, computer, water jug, he says my big co, and then he interrupts himself to say big clear container. I put big clear containers in my truck. And he says, so it's easy just to pull out, pull in, just depending on what I'm planning to use. So where were those containers? When Chris Watts arrived back from Survey 319, where were those big clear containers? People forget about that. Did people forget to look for that? Or is he just not telling the truth? Did he not put clear containers? Why would he say put clear containers in if he didn't? What could have been in those clear containers? So anyway, food for thought. Then we go on to number 35, Trent Bolt. I don't want to talk too much about this, but at this point, everyone thought he was a factor, and also Amanda McMahon, and everyone was worrying about them, and they weren't worrying so much about Nicole Kessinger. At that point, Nicole Kessinger was, maybe she was involved, and there was some rumors and whispers, whereas Trent Bolt was sort of waving his flag, doing cartwheels, doing kind of flick flacks, just saying, everybody, hey, I was involved, and so everyone was thinking about him. And Amanda McMahon was kind of doing the same. She was sort of running around. She was in international media even saying, Chris Watts had violent sex with me. I know it was him, and this is where we met. And so everyone was sort of gossiping and talking about that. And that sort of allowed Nicole Kessinger to sort of slip through the cracks to some extent, where people just didn't really pay that much attention to her. No one photographed her. No one sort of went after her. And meanwhile, Trent Bolt became kind of the man of the hour. I'm not going to go through sort of everything here. Point number 38, where Chris Watts says, I mean, she could have, and he interrupts himself, he says, she could have just taken off. I don't know. But maybe someone has her and they're not safe. I want them back. And so, yeah, I mean, this is just... just some kind of analysis of the Sermon on the Porch, which was still, all of us were still thinking about it then. And then point number 39, I just provide a little bit of insight. I wrote, as part of ongoing research into this case, I contacted a guy I've known since school who went from being in law enforcement to working for the oil and gas industry. I sent him information on the Anadarko oil sites. I was trying to understand this whole business, this whole complicated situation. And I asked for his input on what the conditions are inside a tank, because it was something new to me as a true crime writer. I wasn't familiar with it, and I wanted to understand it. And I tried to understand it myself, and I thought I would contact someone in the industry and just get their opinion. And so then I addressed some of his insights in a separate blog post, but a few of the things that stood out I discussed in this timeline. And bear in mind, my second book in the series, in the two-phase series, was Beneath the Oil. So these were a couple of the insights. Number one, only an oil maintenance worker would have the tools, know-how to access and open the tanks. This would, in theory, limit the chances of discovery by anyone else to almost zero, at least while Watts was in charge of that particular site. And this also explains why Watts initially repeats the words vanished. How does he know they've vanished? He's kind of saying that they've disappeared. He doesn't say they're missing. He doesn't say they are at a friend's house. He keeps saying vanished. He keeps sort of, and he uses the sort of colorful language of a ghost town, where you don't see anybody. And I felt that he wanted people to think that that's what had happened, because that's what he intended to happen. He wanted them to vanish. He wanted them to disappear permanently. And something that sort of occurred to me while I was writing Silver Fox, Wedded Husband, Wedded Wife, is just the emphasis by the Watts family of appearances. Chris Watts appears to be such a nice guy. Shanann appears to be such a perfect housewife. The whole family appears to be so well. And then there's sickness, and then there's Nutgate, and then there are all these other things going on. And so it just made me think that even the disappearance was the appearance of a disappearance. And then number two, in terms of this analysis, the maintenance of the various oil sites are scheduled. I thought that's also very interesting. So Chris Watts would have known when there would be access to it, and then also when that access would sort of end. In other words, you'd go to a particular well site, fiddle around, fix things, and then you wouldn't need to go there perhaps for weeks or even months at a time. So he could get access to a very access-controlled location that was also very remote on a particular day that he could premeditate, he could pre-arrange, and then no one would have access to it for a really long time. And and the public wouldn't just sort of stumble across it because it was on private property, leased by Anadarko, but nevertheless. And so I found that really interesting. And so this guy was saying some of these places just have annual checks, sometimes once every 5 years. And if Watts knew the schedule, and especially if it was a low-producing well, which I think it was, and if they just emptied the one out, then you wouldn't likely check it for quite a long time, because it would take quite a long time to fill up. If not days or weeks, then months. And then by that time, the remains would most likely have vanished or have deteriorated to virtually nothing. So if Watts knew the schedule, and especially if the checks had been completed for the year, or if Watts himself was responsible for performing them, then he could theoretically supervise and control the access and information regarding his own crime scene. And there was a point where I thought Kessinger might be more involved, because if she was aware of safety, maybe she would get the alerts if there were any anomalies in terms of this. So, and that's something I'm quite surprised the conspiracy nuts haven't struck on, sort of emphasized, is that she could have controlled things from that aspect, especially if she was very much part of some kind of conspiracy accessory thing. I do think Anadarko were worried about that kind of perception, and that's why they needed to get rid of both employees and also make sure it didn't go to trial, so that you couldn't have this thing of, wow, Anadarko are responsible for, they need to have much better security, because you kind of have a situation where people can commit murder and cover it up within their infrastructure. And that would be very embarrassing, and that would cause them to need to ramp up their infrastructure and their security in a very, very big way. So that was definitely an interesting line of reasoning. Then I wanted to know about the interior of the oil tanks. This friend of mine said that it's fairly static, with natural gas sequestrated through outlet sieves. But these sieves could theoretically be blocked by, for example, human hair. And human hair could also theoretically be glued to the lid of the tanks, just because of the heat and all that kind of thing. And but this might indicate a need to remove excess human hair and possibly also clothing. So that was definitely part of my thinking early on, was that did Watts cut his children's hair, and was there hair lying around somewhere? And someone did talk about hair in the back of Watts's truck. It's spoken about on CNN, I think HLN. So, and that's something I mentioned in the previous episode. Then number 40, we see some photographs of Chris Watts with Shanann during her other pregnancies. Something to bear in mind that Watts had been through all of this before. It wasn't the first pregnancy. And Shanann went through that whole thing of, she would blog about it. This time it would be Facebooking each milestone. And this time around, he was very nervous of those milestones being made known. Number 41, when were Bella and Celeste last seen alive? So this question isn't here for nothing. In September, we didn't actually know the answer to that question. And weirdly enough, we are now, as I say, a year and a half later, we still can't be absolutely certain about that. There are different theories. Some people think one of the children was alive for longer than the other, that one child died at home, the other one at the Weld site, and so on. So this question is still relevant, even though it started, the merit for the question sort of started gaining momentum as early as September 2018. And then from early reports, they were saying that, there was a birthday party in Erie on Sunday, and August 12th. And this is less than 20 minutes drive east of Frederick. And so we knew that they were definitely alive on Sunday. As I say, I originally thought, when was the last time that anyone had seen them alive? And one possibility was Friday, when Shanann saw them, early Friday, and I thought Watts took off work on Friday. Did something happen then? Also, he went out with his mistress on Saturday night. Did something happen then? And we know now that he had a babysitter, but we didn't know that then. So there was some reason to suspect they may not have been alive on Friday and Saturday. And as it turned out, they were alive until sort of late Sunday afternoon. And then what about after that? And you can say, well, yes, they FaceTimed with the one set of grandparents, but not the other. And then when Watts barbecued, then they weren't seen. And that is quite strange. When Shanann asked for photos of the children, and this is something that the conspiracy nuts don't mention either, when Shanann said, I want to see pictures of the kids sleeping in bed, Watts couldn't provide them. And he'd provided everything she'd asked for until then. When she'd asked for things previously, asked for favors, will you come with me to school with the kids? Yes. And then this particular request, it's not that he just ignored it. He did send pictures. He just didn't send pictures of them in bed because he couldn't, because they weren't in bed, because they weren't alive, because they weren't sleeping. So we actually saw, at this point, Jeremy Lindstrom talking about the party and talking about how he perceived Chris Watts at this last time that he saw him. And Jeremy Lindstrom was basically the last person that saw Chris Watts, I think, before he committed the first set of crimes. One could argue that Nicole Kessinger was the last person to actually talk to him, but I think you can argue that she was the person he was in contact with closest to when the crimes actually happened in terms of time. But at this point, it looked like Jeremy Lindstrom was that person, or could have been that person. And so he told Denver 7 what kind of guy Chris was. And now bear in mind what we dealt with at the beginning of this episode. And he said the girls were happy, they were normal, and so was Chris. And then this is what Lindstrom said, quote, he would reach out and help anybody that needed help with anything. He said he was a good mechanic. If you needed help with your car, he'd help you. If you needed help with your furniture, he'd be over there in a heartbeat to help you. You don't know what, when, why, where, or how everything goes weird. And so, again, this is providing two sides to Chris Watts. He's a good mechanic, and he's a helpful guy. So much for him being a narcissist, by the way. Do narcissists tend to sort of help people out and be over there in a heartbeat? Or do they just think of themselves? Anyway, and so he does put the question out there. You don't know when everything goes weird, and things did go weird with his family. And so that was quite a good rhetorical question there. Okay, and then number 42, should the DA pursue a death penalty in this case? So that was another question that people were just thinking about, talking about, and what's quite interesting is we actually know now that a plea deal had actually already been negotiated or sort of been offered as early as, well even before September. So actually, even though people were wondering about this, it had actually been finalized quite long ago, but also kept a secret. At this point, the public were led to believe that there was going to be a murder trial. Everyone was getting very excited. The media were getting very excited. And everyone was just waiting for the evidence to come out. And of course, when we thought there was going to be a trial, everybody found out there wasn't, at the trial, which is actually the preliminary hearing. So it's just interesting to see how people were kind of misled at the time. So that's what was one of the questions I asked is, would the DA pursue a death penalty? And the answer is that they didn't. They pursued a plea deal. And so the Denver Post said, according to Colorado law, a district attorney has 63 days from the date of an arraignment to determine whether to pursue capital punishment. And this kind of led people to think, oh, well, I guess we'll find out in 63 days. And this is from the date of an arraignment, right? Okay, and then just jumping a little bit further ahead, we go to 45. Again, this is just quite interesting from the perspective of the actual chronology. There's an article saying Chris Watts isn't talking to his family even though he has nothing else to do except sleep all day. He's not allowed reading material or television. We subsequently found out that he did read a book, I think, at some point, and he did watch television at some point. But anyway, he has virtually no one to talk to except the prison guards who look in on him every 15 minutes as part of an ongoing suicide watch. Now, this part's also, I think, a bit misunderstood, is after Chris Watts sort of signed the plea deal, he kind of got transferred somewhere. And although he was on suicide watch, he was actually kind of on, I guess, a plea deal watch. Was he going to change his mind about that? I mean, I don't know if there's ever any question that he was going to commit suicide. So that part's also quite interesting, I think. And then what I sort of took from this, Chris Watts not talking to his family, I said, well, this could be because he knows, and perhaps they do too, that calls are monitored and that anything they say could be used against him or them. So I thought it could be because they had some kind of involvement, possibly. Number two, I thought he doesn't want to talk to them for the above reason. And I thought there could also be other reasons, and possibly the reasons might have been, okay, if you want this plea deal, we need you not to talk to your family. We don't want your family talking you out of it. We don't want a lawyer involved, like a private lawyer. I just think that's really interesting. And somebody said that, Chris was trying to call his father once and then didn't after that. And then point number 3 was that they don't want to talk to him. I don't think that's true. I think they did want to talk to him. We know Chris Watts' dad flew in to see his son at the time of his arrest. We don't know much more than that, who Watts Sr. is, what he does. We do have a photo of the house at Saratoga Trail. So at this point, we didn't know much about him. Obviously now we know that he is a mechanic. And, we know that he actually sat in on the confession and that he confessed to his father. I don't think we knew at this point that he did confess to his father. I think we just knew that he confessed. If it had been news that Watts had confessed to his father, I think the media would be camped out on the father's lawn. What exactly did he say and all that kind of thing. So Chris Watts' father didn't say much, didn't speak to the media either at this point. 46. Shanann's father was in court during the initial hearing and was memorably emotional about the fate of his daughter and granddaughters. Chris Watts' father wasn't in court, so that's also quite interesting. Despite the fact that Chris Watts, did what he did and said what he said, his father, you never saw him. And again, bear in mind at this point, the plea deal was kind of in process, right? Oh, so not during the initial hearing. Maybe it was in process during the initial hearing. We don't know. Anyway, neither of the mothers were in court, perhaps because they couldn't afford to travel. Point 47, and this is locating exactly where we were in the timeline. So the date was on September 17th, District Attorney Michael J. Rourke vehemently opposed the release of autopsy reports on the basis of injury to the public interest. Now, if you think about that, how was this an injury to the public interest? You could sort of argue that it could upset the Rourkes, I guess. But how could this be an injury to the public interest? Or you could argue that if Chris Watts was going to sign a plea deal, that it was in the interest of the public that that happened. Do you think you could argue that? Do you think you could argue that it was in the interest of the public that the plea deal happened? The motion notes that the autopsy reports are public documents, so Rourke is likely to have an uphill battle withholding them from the public and also from the media until November. He did have an uphill battle, but he did withhold them until November. The motion is explicit that all 3 victims were dead when they were moved from the crime scene, the Watts residence. Right, that's important to stress. The district attorney notes that the cause of death has not yet been made public. I'm not sure if that's accurate, because it says court records suggested they were strangled. So that's quite interesting that the district attorney wasn't sure then that the cause of death, okay. So maybe because they were still waiting for the toxicology, maybe they thought there could be something else. Besides that, Chris Watts has suggested the same, and that irrespective of who committed murder, it was murder by strangling. Okay, so that's something that we knew from the arrest affidavit, that he said that Shanann strangled the children, so it seemed like this was what happened. And so at the time I wrote, possibly this isn't accurate, but even if it isn't, the defense attorneys will be in possession of the same facts. It may be that by going through the motions of putting forward this motion, the district attorney wishes to be seen as being responsible and conservative, as opposed to purposefully and recklessly leaking sensitive documents. Given the high-profile nature of this case, it seems a stretch to imagine October will go by without even a redacted version at least being made public, as occurred in the Ramsey case. So in the Ramsey case, and we know how long it's taken for information to come out of there, they did release a sensitive or a redacted autopsy report. In the Ramsey case, it took 7 months for portions of the autopsy to be made public prior to any hearing. And in that case, there was an army of lawyers and a reluctant prosecutor's office holding the tides at bay. And ultimately, they succeeded. The case never went to criminal court. So I was already starting to compare the Watts case in September to the Ramsey case because of the strange legal shenanigans that were going on. Another example of a redacted autopsy report, although minimally redacted, is the autopsy of Travis Alexander, the infamous murder victim of Jodi Arias. So back to the Watts case, the district attorney through this motion also appeared to be concerned about autopsy results tainting witness testimonies and impacting potential jurors. Now, this is where I have some serious concerns about how this case was handled, because this is clearly a problem. We now know that the district attorney got an email and his deputy, still in August about the plea deal. So what's this business about tainting witnesses if there's going to be no court case? No one's going to be tainted. No jurors are going to be impacted. So by handing this over to the court, the prosecutor's office effectively keeps their side of the story clean, and the onus for the release lies on the partiality of the presiding judge. And what happened? The judge was quite partial. He said, okay, let's do what the prosecutor says. Can I provided a copy of this motion on Crime Rocket, on Christopher Watts, What Else Do We Know? It's the very first post under the tab Chris Watts. So if you go to Crime Rocket, it's right at the top there. And then number 48, HLN's Ashley Banfield interviews Richard Hodges, a former college roommate of Chris Watts, and this is going back more than 13 years, 2003 to 2005. What was he like? And Hodges says straight as an arrow. He describes Watts as very dedicated. He says he does look the part of the dedicated husband, washing dishes, mowing the lawn, keeping fit. But Hodges goes further. He says Watts is a dude that didn't go out partying when everyone else did. He was very hard on himself. And, if you think about him taking the plea deal, admitting guilt, confessing in his own way, and then basically just marching himself off to jail for life, that is kind of what's being, one could argue, harder on himself than most criminals are. And again, you can say, oh, is that being narcissistic when you're hard on yourself? Banfield raises an interesting point when Hodges admits he was the closest to Watts out of their group of friends, but that even they weren't really close. They weren't Facebook pals either. And this made me start wondering if he might be gay. Watts is sort of this enigmatic guy who was hard on himself and misunderstood and whatnot. Was there something else going on? And the whole gay thing was also just kind of a psychological acknowledgement that there's a side to this guy that we don't know, right? So just to quote what was said here, Chris Watts was quiet, he's pretty reserved, but not in like what I would say a negative fashion. He was more of the kind of guy who you become friends with out of happenstance. We were obviously friends because we were in classes together, and that's how we ended up meeting. He very, very rarely went out with us, so maybe that contributed to it. He wanted to get those good grades. He wanted to do well. So he would never do anything to jeopardize that, like partying or drinking. Does that sound like a narcissist? A guy that's hardworking and wants good grades? And we can also see how Watts wouldn't have wanted to lose what he'd achieved and gained sort of again, through another bankruptcy. And I also just want to emphasize what he says there. Chris Watts was quiet and reserved. Everybody said that. He said not in a negative way, but in an introvert way. He doesn't use the word introvert, but that's what he's talking about. So how do you conflate this with... Anyway. Okay, so you can go and listen to that interview on the post, still there. And then there's a incorrectly numbered post 163. It just shows you how far it is on the original numbering, but refers to the Longmont Times-Call serving northern Colorado, where prosecutors were asking the court to order Watts to provide ink footprints, not fingerprints. And this might be because he was potentially walking on the oil infrastructure or something barefoot. So what that could refer to is him changing his boots or his footwear at the site, or possibly stepping on the black plastic bag either while it was on the that metal catwalk or on the ground or something. In any event, they were looking for his footprints. It refers to the CBI that had developed possible barefoot impressions from items of evidence. And this does give one kind of the idea that Watts was trying to cover up evidence. Those boots that he wore, he at some point got rid of them, right? In other words, he wasn't wearing them when he arrived back home. So at some point during the disposal of his family, he was barefooted, which is quite a weird thing to think about. Then at 49, Ashley Banfield interviews a tech expert on the data her Apple Series 3 watch may have stored, automatically uploaded to the cloud in the last hours of her life. This was really fascinating, and it made me think that this was going to be a really interesting case with brand new evidence-led, brand new technology, and it was just going to add a completely new dimension to true crime. And then, unfortunately, as we know, the case was just sidelined. Because we also have this whole ecosystem of data around the Vivint technology as well. there was also all the social media, that whole fabric that would sketch a kind of narrative as well. Just to go back to 49, it just refers to, had the authorities extracted the data uploaded automatically to the cloud? I think the answer to that is yes. I mean, we see that in the discovery. Number 50, in an order oddly dated 2 days from that date, Judge Kopko denies Watts' request to investigate leaks by law enforcement. So it's quite interesting that Christopher Watts thought there were leaks, and the judge denied looking into that. It would be interesting to know from Chris Watts now what he thought about that. Like, what kind of leaks was he worried about? Maybe it's the barefoot impressions. What else could it be? Another one that's incorrectly numbered, but it's 166. Chris Watts also refused to consent to DNA tests, citing lack of probable cause. That's interesting. 51, Chris Watts' case. Bear in mind, lack of probable cause, and he's already signed is already part of this whole plea deal. So you can't tell me that he genuinely believes there's lack of probable cause. It's what the public are thinking. Anyway, 51, Chris Watts' case expert says trace DNA could be found on daughters' bodies. I don't know whether I agree with that. I really don't think I agree with that. At the time I said it feels like lousy clickbait with the play on the word could. The article isn't stating that trace DNA was found, but that it could foreseeably be found. But I don't even think that's very likely. Anyway, point number 52. In the same way that the Denver channel appears to be using suggestive language to lure clickbait, the Daily Camera is as well. Chris Watts' defense attorney accusing the DA of withholding evidence. Number 53, if the adultery, and I'll put you in brackets, adulteries, maybe there was a much darker, broader side of the unknown Chris Watts than we knew. If his adulteries played a significant role in why he committed murders, then Chris Watts must be aching to see his lover or lovers. But to do so could wreck his legal case. And so a judge denied the request of Chris Watts to keep the names of his jail visitors under seal. I don't know what that's all about. I don't know if he simply wanted his family to visit him, and if they did visit him, the media would know who these people were exactly, and they would go after them. I don't know if that was the case, if his sister visited him, but certainly interesting. 54, the autopsy results must be submitted to court no later than today, September 25th. So that was the deadline, and the prosecution didn't submit the autopsy results. So that's point 54 on September 25th. And I don't know if you remember, we all breathlessly waited for those autopsy results. What were we going to see? What is the cause of death going to be? What were we going to find out? How had Shanann died? What had happened to her? At that point, we didn't know. Could she have been physically assaulted? Could she have been stabbed or something? What had happened? And then on HLN, point number 55, there's a discussion about the importance of bruise patterns on the children's necks. I'm not really going to go into that here. Point 56, many were expecting the arrival, if not the release, of the autopsy reports today. The Denver Post confirmed that according to the prosecution, the autopsy reports were not available. So the prosecution's kind of excuse for not providing the autopsy reports on this deadline were that they didn't have them themselves, that they weren't available. Point 57, and that's the last one I'm going to look at. According to the Colorado, and the court has ordered Weld DA to release autopsy results to Chris Watts' attorneys. So the court ordered the DA to release the autopsy results. Okay, let me just do one more. This is number 58, and then we'll leave it at that. There appears to be unprecedented interest in gaining access to the autopsy results of the 4 victims. The media have made the intentions clear, public as well. The media are calling the Weld County Coroner's Office on a daily basis. And we know that the media did institute a legal action against the district attorney, which I think was going to be heard in December. So the release before that prevented that from being heard in court. And that's it. Since this video is already almost 50 minutes long, I'm not going to deal with the autopsy evidence here. What I do want to do is compare the dramatization in the Lifetime movie to the autopsy. Not the way everybody sees it, but the true crime rocket science analysis of it. So I'm going to do that in a separate video, probably not a very long one, maybe 10 minutes. And just dealing with that specific thing, which is, it's not a very complex study. It's not necessarily simple, but it's also not something one needs to spend a lot of time on. I'm also going to just touch on another aspect that is related to today's episode, just in terms of the dates where they say that the various reports are not available. I'm just going to touch on that as well. So it's important that you remember what we've spoken about here, especially towards the end, because the episode dealing with that is kind of going to be a part 2, a brief part 2 to what we've dealt with here. In any event, thank you for listening. I do want to draw your attention to some content that's available on Patreon. So first of all, the latest episode on the Atkinson transcripts, we're already up to episode 10. There are 15 in total, so that's something you can go and look at on Patreon on the $1 tier. On the $2 tier is an ongoing series debunking the farcical podcast on John Benet Ramsey, which comes out every Monday. So you can go and look out for that. And then, just a reminder that the second books in the Silver Fox trilogies come out. It's available on Kindle. I'll put a link in the description where you can purchase it. So this is the latest book on Chris Watts. There's a little bit of analysis on Lena Derhali's version of his psychology. I've provided just my response to that. And I've written the book from the perspective of the prism of marriage, which is a really interesting viewpoint. I found it really does crystallize the psychology in a very interesting way. So you can look out for that. Then I'm also putting up the audiobook version of that on Patreon under the $10 tier. And then the paperback version should be available early next week. I do recommend you purchase the Kindle version because there are a lot of links to blogs, news stories. Some of the interrogation is linked to the very second that certain things are said, and certain nuances in the statements and self-interruptions sort of brought up, and you can sort of really get to that in interactive ways that you can't with the paperback version. I do understand some people prefer the paperback, so there will be 3 versions of this available: audiobook on Patreon under the $10 tier, Amazon. It's available on Amazon Kindle and Unlimited, and then the paperback, which should be out early next week. Thank you for listening, and I'll speak to you guys next time.
Outside of his body, the before and after transformation, does it tell you anything about what a man can be like on the other side?
This tells me that ego may have taken over for Chris Watts. All of a sudden, he was ripped. Women may have been looking at him. He was having financial problems with his wife, 2 kids, another one on the way. He, I think, was wanting to get out there and feel attractive and feel that excitement. And I see what Shanann was doing as a plea, saying, don't destroy this family.